Hello, strangers. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, 302 strangers. 300. I don't think I know 300 people. That's a wild number, and one that would make me a little nervous, if my nerves weren't so thoroughly tested already, that is. And they have been, because each and every one of these stories told every week is original, not told before, and true. Well, with minor embroidery and embellishments, of course, to protect the innocent and guilty alike. So, I'm Vi. You're wonderful. And this is Story 13. The year I was in 4th grade, I lived in Illinois with my parents. They both worked, so after school I had a babysitter. Naz was there every day when I got home. She was a sweet older lady. Her kids had all grown up and moved out, and her husband had passed away. I guess maybe she was looking for a family as much as our family was looking for someone like her. She was wonderful. I'd met her when I was real young and into Star Wars, the prequels, and in her sari she looked like a kindly Jedi. And she laughed when I said that. She even played along that she'd Jedi mind trick me into doing my chores. And I'd play along right back, acting like a stupefied zombie, repeating her orders, fully under her galactic hypnosis. She told the best stories, and she made the best food. I love her. Still, she did have other kids, grown or not. It happened one Friday afternoon in September. She asked my mom if she could arrange someone else for a couple afternoons the next week, so she could visit her daughter. My mom began asking the other moms for kids old enough to babysit, and a couple of names came up. Mom knew how close I was to Naz. She decided I should have some say in the matter. So she arranged a couple of them to come by on different afternoons so I could try them on for size. At first, it was Alan, Josie, and Tina. Well, right away, Josie flaked. That left just Alan and Tina. I had the suspicion my mom wanted Tina. Not that she was overtly sexist. I guess when you think of babysitters, you just think of girls before boys. So, one afternoon at 4:30, a blue car pulled up to our house, and out got the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. She had long hair like Naz, but hers was blonde, pulled back with a headband. She didn't wear Jedi clothes, but a baby tee that showed a sliver of her stomach, and she had big brown eyes framed by dark lashes. I was in love instantly. She came gliding up the walk, big perfect smile when she greeted my mom and dad. I watched through the window, thoroughly embarrassed and shy. My parents came into my room, and Tina followed. That big smile was still in place. And my parents were suddenly telling me to behave, get my chores done, baby stuff they never reminded me to do with Naz. I blushed, embarrassed in front of this perfect girl. I dared take a look at her. She gave me a wink, which made me feel better almost instantly. My parents, finally done humiliating me, retreated to the garage. They'd had some running around town to do. They were eager to see how the test run went. Tina waved at them from the window, and then turned to face me, asking, "So how old are you anyway?" "I'm 9, I blurted out, pausing to think of what I should say next. "What about you?" 14, but I'll be 15 in June." She ran a hand through her straight blonde hair. It glinted like Naz's, but gold, not blue, black. "So, did you have, homework?" I was eager to show her that, unlike what my parents had implied, I could get right into it without needing to be told like a big dumb baby. And I did. We were doing long division, though, and it was a concept I struggled with. Naz had taught me to picture the big numbers like a bag of gumballs, and then count out multiples of how many it would take to get as close to a small remainder as possible. This meant I closed my eyes a lot as I'd imagine the gumballs and begin trying 2 by. No. 3 by. No. 4 by. So when a hot, sharp pain sprang down my arm, I wasn't ready for it. I jumped, jolted back, eyes flying open. But Tina's long, perfectly manicured nails were high up on my upper arm, pinching me hard. Goof off. Your parents didn't tell me that you were such a little troublemaker. She said this smiling, as though she was just saying hello again or remarking on the weather. Even her eyes smiled, but mine were filling with tears, at which she finally released my arm from her claws. And a little crybaby. What's the matter? Used to goofing off and then crying your way out of trouble? Those are called crocodile tears. They're fake. Because you're a little faker. I tried to explain that no, I wasn't faking, I wasn't goofing off, I was counting, but the whining sound of my own voice seemed to agree with her. I knew I was crying from the suddenness and the pain, but she looked so confident as she declared me names: goof off, crybaby, faker. And with that sweet little smile and her smooth voice, steady, not angry, sounding just as cheerful as you can imagine. I was immediately wondering if I was wrong. Had I been goofing off? I mean, how could someone so pretty and so cheerful be wrong? She was still smiling at me as she said, "Counting what? Things you'd rather be doing than listening to me?" She watched my face intently, as though waiting to see if I would continue to plead my innocence. But she'd hit on a common complaint with my parents. I daydreamed. My father's exasperation in having to repeat things to me, annoyance that I wasn't listening. Well, I knew who they'd believe if she decided to tell on me. She settled back on her heels, kneeling in front of the coffee table opposite me. And even though I knew I had been counting, I knew I'd been working through the tricky division that really had a lot of multiplication in it. So I stopped trying to explain myself. I just rubbed my arm over my eyes, then got back to work. It was harder not being able to picture the gumballs, but I gamely worked through all the problems, making little ticks to count instead. She retreated to the couch and began leafing through my mom's magazines. She had this odd little off-tune melody she kept humming, over and over. It was distracting, but just when I looked up to ask her to stop, her big doe eyes slid off the paper to me, as though daring me to say something. My upper arm pained. I got back to work. Once I'd finished, I stood up, and then carried my paper over to her, holding it out for her to take. She looked up from her magazine, then down at the paper, asking, "Any wrong answers?" I was confused. That was why Naz always checked over my work, to make sure I hadn't done a wrong answer. Tina took in my expression and sat up, closing the magazine. "Surely you double-checked before you came over here to waste my time. What, let me guess, you just faked doing the work so that the big grown-ups can fix it all up for you, right?" She sighed. I watched her nails begin to tap, tap, tap on the magazine. "No one's this slow. You're just faking again, aren't you?" That word again. I'd never been called a faker, but I hated it. And for a moment, I opened my mouth to tell her so, but I saw her hands clasp on the magazine. Her pink nails seemed to glint in the light. I closed my mouth. The doubt was back, because wasn't it true that Naz often found mistakes in my work? Was I really trying my hardest? Or was I faking, shoving it off onto her to fix for me? Had I been wrong all the times before? The certainty in the way Tina said these things was stirring up more doubt than I'd ever had. I suddenly felt like I'd been caught in training wheels when everyone else was on regular bikes. One last sorrowful thought. Why didn't anyone tell me that's not how it's supposed to go? But it threatened to make my eyes tear up. Crybaby, crocodile tears, faker. Instead, I just dropped my head again. I went back to the coffee table to rework the problems. And in the background, the pages of the magazine fluttered along with that wormy little humming tune, over and over. That is, until the humming stopped. In that same lilting voice, Tina spoke. I couldn't force myself to look up, but I kept my pencil moving on the paper. Hey, little faker. If you're thinking about telling your parents any of what happened, word of advice, you're the only one who's going to be in trouble. After all, you made me have to remind you, and you wanted me to do your homework for you. And no one's going to believe some lie you tell about me, like being mean. This last bit she said in a silly voice. They'll know you're faking. They probably know that about you already, and they just put up with it. Very irresponsible parenting, she said loftily, tossing the magazine and rooting around for another. Was this just insane, absolutely absurd? All she had to do was tell my parents something and my parents would believe her, a practical stranger, over me, their own kid. Yeah, but with my big imagination and the knowledge that she was a big kid, a teenager, and as of this afternoon, my discovery that I was the last dummy in the room to get it. Did it make sense that they'd believe her? It did, in the same way sometimes you got in trouble when it wasn't your fault, when you weren't the one who talked in class or the one who broke the pencil sharpener. I was 9, but 9 was old enough to have learned that life wasn't fair. So when my parents returned, I said nothing. They had Noz with them. Tina was up and off the couch, magazine back in the rack. She was all smiles and chirping polite questions. I kept my head down, eyes glued on my paper. I was on round 3, having found 2 different answers to a couple of questions. I needed the best of 3 odds to be totally sure I'd done them right. Still, Noz's soft tan hand, lighter than my own, came down over the paper, smoothing it out. There's my Padawan, she said. I could tell from her voice she was smiling, but unlike with Tina, hers sounded real. I looked up. Something on my face made her smile dim, and then melt, and then frown. Are you okay? I just nodded, eyes up and glued to Tina's back. Tina was still cooing over my parents, acting like she'd never seen such a great batch of produce before. I looked at Noz, and though she was the one who had all the Jedi powers, I tried my best to tell her what had happened by thinking it really hard at her, keeping my mouth shut. Because, from the looks on my parents' faces, Tina would be returning, and she'd be there with me, longer, all alone. I couldn't risk her knowing I'd told. Noz looked into my eyes, and then rose stiffly to her feet. I thought for a moment she was going to say it out loud, in front of Tina, but the fear on my face must have gotten through, if nothing else did. Noz merely smiled, and then padded over to my parents and began carrying the groceries on through to the kitchen. After Tina left, and Noz had served dinner, we all sat around the table. I was staying quiet, scared. On the one hand, I knew my parents wouldn't be cool with someone hurting me, but it was just a pinch. My doubt was growing. What kind of baby would complain about a pinch? Coupled with Tina very easily being able to combat anything I said with charges of goofing off and not paying attention. My parents would never take it seriously. I was full of doubt now in a way I'd never been before, but that thought, the thought of her standing there, too confident, eyes locked on mine, speaking so matter-of-factly, that was just too easy to picture. My stomach hurt. My eyes felt suspiciously wet again. It was like we were on a train ride at the park, stuck on rails, heading towards a dark tunnel in which something bad would happen, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, a light in the tunnel. Noz was standing, but she turned and spoke to my mom, saying that it turned out her Sophie had a lot going on next week, and how they were decided to catch up on Saturday instead. Thus, there was no reason to bring anyone, and she said this part firmly, in to watch me. I was 9. Girls were still icky at 9, but I could have kissed Nas. And the next week, it was Nas, same as always, and the week after. Somehow, she worked it so her visits and trips were on weekends only, and on a couple of occasions when a dinner fell on a weeknight, she brought me along. We resumed our normal pattern. While she frowned when I told her I wouldn't ask her to check my work, that I'd do it right by myself, she didn't push. My grades were a little bumpy, but I was determined to show her I'd learned the right way, and not to fake it. Things were normal, and I was quick to put the bad day from my mind. But if I had forgotten Tina, she hadn't forgotten me. That year, our school put on a Halloween carnival with tons of little games and booths to win candy, toys, and in the case of the raffle, gift certificates to the movie theater. I went as Zorro that year. The games were things like cornhole, lawn darts, just fun stuff, intermissions to help kids take little breaks between stuffing in candy. There was a cakewalk with little cupcakes, but I passed it up and made my way around the booths until I found the fishin' hole. It was basically a blue shower curtain with construction paper fish glued to it. It was one of the games my mom had worked on personally. I was proud of her hard work. The fish glittered, and they almost looked like they were moving when they'd catch a bit of breeze. I took a neon green toy fishing rod from the lady manning the front of the booth. Then I flicked the pole so the big clothespin on the end sailed over the curtain. I felt it pull, felt the line shake as someone clipped my prize to it. A small plastic baggie was clipped to my rod. It was full of caramel popcorn and peanuts, homemade Cracker Jacks. There was a jaunty pink ribbon tied to it. If I'd gotten this trick-or-treating, no doubt my parents would have told me, "No way. You were being warned all the time of razor blades and other things that people could do to homemade treats." And I wasn't a big fan of Cracker Jacks, so I wouldn't have fussed. But this was a school thing. All the treats had either been purchased or made by the home ec class. There was this assurance of safety there. So I dutifully put the baggie into my pillowcase. I thanked the lady running the booth, and I moved on. As I did, though, I had a weird sudden chill. I realized that, just for a moment, I thought I'd heard humming. I strained my ears, but in the din of excited kids and parents telling them to calm down, the snatch of sound was lost. I shook it off, and I kept moving. At the end of the night, my pillowcase was bursting full, and I was exhausted. I'd been eating candy all night, and the crash was real. My parents had me dump out my candy into a big salad bowl so I could portion it out over time. My dad's eyes lit up at the Cracker Jacks, as I knew they would. Cracker Jacks were his all-time favorite, and I figured he'd take those as his spoils. I was happy to share it with him. I took off my costume and off to bed I went, falling asleep almost instantly. It was still dark when I was shaken awake. Nas was there. Confused, I thought I must be dreaming, but I wasn't. It was 1 a.m., and Nas was there because my father was very sick. I thought they meant sick like flu sick, and I asked if that's what she meant. But she said no. Dad had been fine, but as he'd gotten into bed, his speech had started to slur. My mom asked if he'd had a drink, but he hadn't. He then told her he was getting a splitting headache. Concerned, she thought he might be having a stroke. She'd called Nas to come watch me while she took my dad to the ER. My dad's condition worsened rapidly, and the last Nas had heard from a brief telephone call was that the doctors thought my dad had a petite mal seizure, not a stroke. I didn't know what a lot of this meant, but I knew it wasn't good. Even how serious it sounded was scary. But it was worse than even that. My dad had thrown up, and the doctor insisted a sample be sent for testing. And the results? Large amounts of glycolic acid and oxalic acid, components commonly found in antifreeze. The only thing my dad had eaten in the 2-hour window before he got sick were, of course, the homemade Cracker Jacks. I found out later that, while lots of people had received baggies of Cracker Jacks, just as I had, only my dad had gotten sick enough to have to go to the emergency room. I imagine it won't surprise you to also hear that the homemade Cracker Jacks, as with the cupcakes for the cakewalk and the cookies for the cornhole prizes, had all been made by the home ec class yet again. Yet, only my dad had been poisoned. And it was poisoning, intentional. From what the doctors said, that it was antifreeze used instead of strychnine or ammonia pointed to it being on purpose. This was because of common household poison sources. Only antifreeze tastes sweet. I imagine you've all guessed who was in that home ec class. My parents were rattled, but they didn't pursue anything. At the time, I was relieved. That humming I know I heard at the carnival just made everything fit together too perfectly for her not to be involved somehow. When I brought it up later, having thought about it, grown, and the terror had given way to a sense of injustice, I found that my parents had believed we were targeted, but as like a racial thing. It was a small, tight-knit community. While this kind of thing happened, my parents, proud and seeing a response as an admission of weakness, a report to saying they couldn't handle their own business, they didn't pursue it. My mom told me that part of her not wanting to make a big stir about it was that to that point, they'd felt so accepted in the community. By making a fuss, she'd have to lose that feeling of safety. So she chose to pretend it never happened. Like mother, like son, I guess. Dad chalked it up to some sort of freak accident. When she told me this last part, the guilt was thick as if I'd poisoned my father myself. If only she'd known the attempt on her husband's life wasn't meant for her husband, but for her kid. That it wasn't a parent who smiled at her in the supermarket, but whispered against her in the PTA meetings. Someone farther removed from any influence. But I didn't know how to tell her, not even after all these years. Whole government organizations have been formed to study, to try and explain people with broken souls who seemingly live only to hurt others. Would Mom have believed that the evil done that night against her family came from one of these bad apples? Would Dad have believed the person who laced his favorite treat with antifreeze wore size 4 Jordache jeans and popped bubblegum between candy pink lips? How could either of them understand that? I mean, even now, I don't. Story 13. There's an awful lot of scary stories that play on having an unlikely antagonist. Something cheerful, pretty, young and innocent, perverted into something unexpectedly evil. But who do you think is the bigger bad guy here? The real monster? Because Tina, well, she's just a girl. Insecure, unconfident, a hurt person wanting to hurt someone else, or just mentally malignant. She's subject to age and taxes and traffic, the same as the rest of us. But that seed she planted in my friend's head, that doubt. When he told me this story, that was the part where his eyes got real wide and his hands moved the most. Things like that don't have to take tests in school, pay into retirement. They don't eventually get old and die. They're in there. They're in the filing cabinet of your brain until you open that drawer, take a deep breath, look them dead in the eye, and face them down. This may not be a one and done. You may have to fight every day for a long time. But you will win. You want to know how I know? because you're here, choosing not to turn the dial, but to listen in to something scary on purpose. You have what it takes to face your fears, because you're already doing it, at least once every Tuesday, right here with me. So take heart and take care, strangers.